Imagine you're an experienced mountaineer. You've done this dozens of times. You know these mountains, you know the cold, you know exactly what to do if something goes wrong. Now imagine something goes wrong, and you cut your way out of your own tent from the inside, in the middle of the night, in temperatures of minus 30 degrees Celsius, and you run, without shoes, without jackets, away from the only shelter you have. In February 1959, 9 of the Soviet Union's most experienced hikers did exactly that. They were found dead across the slopes of a mountain the local Monsey people called Kholat Syakhl, the Dead Mountain. Their tent had been torn open from the inside. Their bodies were scattered across the snow in various states of undress. One was missing her tongue. Several showed radiation levels high enough to concern Soviet investigators. And the official cause of death, an unknown compelling force. This is the Dyatlov Pass Incident. And 65 years later, nobody has a satisfactory explanation. January 1959. The Soviet Union was at the height of its power and its paranoia. Sputnik had just been launched. The space race was accelerating. And in Sverdlovsk, a city in the Ural Mountains so sensitive it didn't appear on Western maps, 10 students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute set out for a ski trek to Oterten Mountain. The group was led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, an experienced hiker and engineering student who had organized numerous expeditions. His team was equally qualified. Several held the highest Soviet sports classification for mountaineering. These were not reckless amateurs, they were elite. Their route would take them through the northern Urals, one of the most remote and harsh terrains in the Soviet Union. The plan was straightforward: trek to Otorten, plant a flag, return in 3 weeks. One member turned back early due to illness. The remaining 9 continued into the mountains. They were never seen alive again. When the group failed to return by the agreed date, a search party was organized. On February 26th, they found the abandoned camp on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, a name that translates depending on the dialect as Dead Mountain or Mountain of the Dead. What they found there would confound investigators, scientists, and researchers for the next 6.5 decades. The tent was found partially buried in snow, pitched on an exposed slope. This alone was strange. Experienced hikers would never camp on an open, windswept slope when a sheltered forest was nearby. But stranger still, the tent had been cut open from the inside. Someone had slashed through the canvas to escape, not unzipped, cut. Whatever made 9 experienced mountaineers cut their way out of their only shelter and run downhill into a forest in the dark, in a blizzard, without adequate clothing, it happened fast. There was no time to dress, no time to grab supplies, only time to run. The first 2 bodies were found at the forest's edge, near the remains of a small fire. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonashenko were found in their underwear, their hands and feet showing signs they had tried to climb a nearby cedar tree. They had frozen to death. 3 more bodies, including Igor Dyatlov himself, were found between the forest and the tent, in positions suggesting they had been trying to return to camp when they died. They were partially dressed. Then the search stalled. The remaining 4 bodies weren't found until May when the snow melted, and these 4 were different. Lyudmila Dubanina was found without her tongue, eyes, and part of her lips. The official explanation that soft tissue had decomposed due to water exposure has been disputed by investigators ever since. Her ribcage had been crushed. So had Semyon Zolotarev's. The internal damage was consistent with the force of a car crash, but there was no external bruising. One investigator compared the injuries to what you'd see in victims of an explosion. Perhaps most disturbing, several items of clothing from these 4 hikers tested positive for radioactive contamination. The Soviet investigation lasted several months, then it was abruptly closed. The files were classified, and the cause of death was officially recorded as an unknown compelling force. The Soviet government's official position was, and remained for decades, essentially, we don't know and we're not discussing it. The case files were sealed and transferred to a classified archive where they remained until 1990. When the files were finally examined by independent researchers, the official explanation that emerged was a natural one. An avalanche or a sudden katabatic wind event had caused the hikers to panic and flee the tent in the night. The crushing injuries to the 4 hikers, the theory went, came from being buried under heavy snow. This explanation has some scientific support. A 2019 Swiss avalanche study attempted to model the scenario mathematically and suggested a small, unusual slab avalanche could have produced the observed injuries. But critics immediately pointed out the flaws. No avalanche debris was ever found at the scene. The slope angle was too shallow for most avalanche scenarios, and an avalanche doesn't explain the radiation, it doesn't explain the missing tongue, and it certainly doesn't explain why experienced mountaineers fled downhill instead of taking any of the survival actions they would have been trained to perform. The most persistent theory involves Soviet military testing. The Ural Mountains in 1959 were not empty wilderness. The region was home to some of the Soviet Union's most classified military installations. The military regularly tested missiles, rockets, and experimental technology in the surrounding airspace. Some researchers, including former Soviet investigator Lev Ivanov, have suggested that the hikers encountered a classified military test, possibly involving infrasound weapons or experimental parachute mines. Ivanov himself later admitted he was ordered to close the investigation and classify the findings, and that he believed outside forces were involved. Multiple witnesses in the region reported seeing glowing orange spheres in the sky over the Urals during the winter of 1958 to 1959, including on the night the Dyatlov group died. Soviet military logs from the period contain references to experimental launches in the area. Some investigators believe the hikers witnessed something they weren't supposed to see and were silenced, either deliberately or as collateral damage from a weapons test. The Mansi people, the indigenous inhabitants of the region, had their own explanation. Kolatsiakal, they said, was a forbidden mountain. Something lived there that did not welcome visitors. We have natural explanations. We have military theories. We have ancient warnings. What we don't have is proof for any of them. Whatever the external cause, the behavior of the Dyatlov group in their final hours reveals something deeply unsettling about the human body under extreme stress. Consider paradoxical undressing, a well-documented phenomenon in severe hypothermia cases. As the body's core temperature drops below a critical threshold, the peripheral blood vessels suddenly dilate. The rush of warm blood to the skin creates an intense burning sensation. The dying person feels, paradoxically, that they are overheating. They tear off their clothes. This explains some of what happened to the Dyatlov group, but not all of it. What could cause 9 experienced, rational people to simultaneously panic beyond their training? Psychologists who have studied survival situations describe a phenomenon called cognitive tunneling. Under extreme terror, the brain narrows its focus to a single perceived threat and a single escape route, overriding all rational planning. The amygdala takes over. The prefrontal cortex, where training, reasoning, and decision-making live, goes offline. Something frightened these 9 people beyond the reach of their training. Something that didn't give them time to think. Something that made cutting and running, without shoes, without coats, without light, feel like the only option. We know what panic looks like. We still don't know what caused it. In 2019, Russian prosecutors reopened the Dyatlov Pass case after decades of pressure from families and researchers. After a year-long investigation using modern forensic techniques, they announced their conclusion: a small, unusual avalanche. The families of the victims rejected the finding. The researchers who have spent their careers on this case rejected it. The questions that can't be answered by snow, the radiation, the missing tongue, the sealed files, the military activity, remain unanswered. The 9 people who died on Kolatsiakal were young, brilliant, experienced, and prepared for everything they could imagine. They were not prepared for whatever they encountered on that slope on the night of February 1st, 1959. 65 years later, we still don't know what it was. What do you think happened at Dyatlov Pass? A natural disaster? A military accident? Something else entirely? Let me know in the comments. and subscribe to Redacted Files, because some files were sealed for a reason.